Everyone at the base remembered the day Onyx bit a captain. Nobody remembered there was a second file, a dental report filed the same afternoon and sitting one hallway away for 18 months, until the oldest recruit on base finally walked down that hallway. The folder sat in a metal cabinet in the medical wing, third drawer down, wedged between a supply requisition and a vaccination log nobody had updated since spring. A strip of tape across the top read K9, Onyx, Dental, and under that, in smaller ink, a date that meant nothing to anyone who passed it. Dust had settled into the crease of the folder the way dust settles into anything nobody opens. 18 months of dust. 18 months of a hallway that led nowhere because nobody walked it. Soren Van Tassel didn't know the folder existed. He didn't know the hallway existed either, not yet, not the way that mattered. What he knew, standing at the back of a briefing room at 0630 with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand, was that he was 41 years old and the youngest man in the room was 23. The instructor, a broad-shouldered lieutenant named Prubwit, was running through a training reel for the new intake, old footage, used every cycle to teach dogs and handlers what not to do. Grainy demo camera, a dog on a lead, a row of folding chairs where officers used to sit and watch. Standard incident review, Prubwit said, thumb already on the remote. This one's a classic example of escalation under stress. The footage rolled. A German Shepherd cross bounded across a training field, and then came a jump cut, the kind that comes from a tape scrubbed too many times, a dog Soren didn't recognize, black and tan, lunging toward a man in dress uniform. The frame froze there, mid-motion, jaw wide, before Prubwit clicked forward past it entirely. Anyway, Prubwit said, moving on. Soren watched the room. Nobody reacted. A few recruits checked their phones under the table. The frozen frame had lasted maybe 4 seconds. Long enough to see a shape, not long enough to understand it. Then it was gone, replaced by a slide about leash tension. He almost let it go. 41 years of knowing when to let things go. But something in the frozen shape stayed with him the way a smell stays in a room after the person who made it has left. He leaned toward the recruit next to him, a wiry kid named Delgado who'd been at the base 3 months longer than Soren. That dog, Soren said low, the one in the old clip. Anyone know what happened to it? Delgado shrugged without looking up from his phone. Onyx, bit Captain Ashworth at a demo, way before my time. Nobody talks about it. Where's the dog now? Kennel, I guess. They kept her around. Nobody wants her though. Delgado said it the way you'd mention a broken vending machine, a known fact, filed away, not worth further thought. Soren wanted to ask more. He didn't. Prubwit was already calling the room to attention for the day's assignments, and a man who'd spent the last 2 decades learning exactly how much space he was allowed to take up in a room full of younger men knew better than to raise his hand over a dog nobody else cared about. He drank the rest of his coffee. It was worse cold than it had been hot. After the briefing, the duty roster went up on the corkboard by the door, a printed sheet, names in one column, assignments in the next, the ink still slightly damp from the office printer. Recruits filed past it in 2s and 3s, scanning for their names, groaning or nodding depending on what they found. Soren waited until the crowd thinned before he stepped up to read his own. Van Tassel, S, K9 Kennel Duty, Onyx. He read it twice. Somewhere behind him, a laugh started. Short, sharp, already halfway to a joke before he'd even turned around. The laugh belonged to Petty Officer Win Castile, and he didn't bother lowering his voice. Kennel Duty, Onyx. Castile shook his head like he'd just watched a man step on a rake in slow motion. They gave the old guy the crazy dog. That's actually perfect. A couple of recruits near the corkboard grinned. Nobody defended Soren. Nobody had a reason to. He was still new enough that most of them only knew his name from the roster, and a name on a roster doesn't earn a man any allies. She's not crazy, Delgado offered mildly, already walking away. She's just, Onyx. She put a captain in the infirmary, Castile said. That's not just, that's a liability with fur. He looked at Soren directly for the first time, sizing him up the way a man sizes up a used truck he has no intention of buying. No offense, Van Tassel. But you sure you're up for that? Wrangling a dog like that takes reflexes, quick hands, I'll manage, Soren said. Sure. Castile clapped him once on the shoulder, too hard to be friendly, too light to be a real blow. Hey, heads up, they still haven't cleared the old training field behind the kennels. Some of the gear from the exercise back when Onyx bit Ashworth never got hauled off. Nobody's bothered. He said it like a piece of trivia, already turning away, already forgetting it as he said it. Then, over his shoulder, grinning, "Try not to get eaten, old man." A few of the recruits laughed again. It wasn't cruel exactly. Soren had heard cruel, years ago, in barracks that made this one feel gentle, but it landed somewhere it didn't need to land, and he stood there a moment holding his crushed coffee cup while the group dispersed toward the mess hall. He walked to the kennels anyway. There was nowhere else to walk to. The K9 block sat at the far edge of the base, past the motor pool, close enough to the water that the wind carried salt into everything. The chain link, the concrete runs, the metal roof that pinged faintly when the sun hit it. A gull screamed somewhere out past the fence line. Most of the kennels were empty at this hour, dogs out on morning training, handlers calling commands in the distance in the flat, repetitive cadence of men who'd said the same words 10,000 times. One kennel wasn't empty. Onyx lay in the shade at the back of her run, a Belgian Malinois, lean and dark-coated, her ears already up before Soren's boots hit the gravel. She didn't bark, she didn't move much at all, just watched him come, head low, eyes tracking with a stillness that felt more deliberate than fear. A water bowl sat untouched near the fence, half in sun, a film already forming on the surface. Someone had filled it that morning and moved on without checking whether she'd drunk any of it. Soren stopped outside the gate. He'd handled dogs before, years ago. In a different life he didn't talk about much anymore, and he made himself remember the shape of that. Slow hands, no sudden angles, let the animal do the deciding, never the man. "Hey," he said, nothing clever. Just the word, low, flat, the kind of tone you'd use on someone half asleep. Onyx's eyes moved from his face to his shoulder and stayed there. Soren followed her gaze without thinking and found nothing remarkable, just the patch on his uniform, standard issue, the kind every recruit wore, faded slightly at one corner from repeated washing. He glanced back at her. She hadn't moved, hadn't growled, hadn't done any of the things 18 months of hallway gossip had promised him she would do. She'd simply gone still in a different way, fixed on that one square of fabric on his shoulder like it was the only thing in the yard worth watching. He crouched slowly, one knee in the gravel, small stones biting through the fabric of his trousers, and let his hand rest on top of the gate without reaching through it. "They said you'd come at me," Soren said, quiet enough that it was mostly for himself. "You're not even looking at me." She wasn't. Her eyes stayed locked on the patch, unblinking, watchful but settled, no tension coiled in it. He watched her nostrils flare once, twice, reading the air between them the way dogs read everything, and still she didn't move toward him and didn't move away. Soren looked down at his own shoulder again, turned it slightly out of curiosity, and watched her track the movement, not his hand, not his face. The patch. When he turned back the other way, her eyes followed the fabric and nothing else, as if the man wearing it barely registered at all. He didn't know what it meant, probably nothing, a scent or a color that had nothing to do with him at all. He only knew that everything he'd heard about this dog in the last 20 minutes had promised teeth, and what he was looking at instead was something that looked almost like waiting. She held herself the way a creature holds still after too many boots have crossed this gravel and none of them stopped. He stayed crouched at the gate a long while, longer than duty required, until the sun moved enough to put his shadow across her paws. Onyx didn't flinch from it. She simply lay there, watching the patch on his shoulder, patient in a way that had nothing to do with training. "Whatever you're waiting for," Soren said finally, rising, his knees protesting the way they always did now. "It isn't me, not yet anyway." He filled her water bowl before he left, dumping out the warm film-covered water and running the hose until it ran cold. She watched him do it. She didn't come closer, and she didn't drink while he was still there, but she was watching, still watching, all the way to the gate. 3 days into kennel duty, Soren found the logbook. It lived on a shelf inside the equipment shed, a battered green ledger with K9 Kennel, daily records stamped on the cover, the kind of book nobody thought to digitize because nobody thought it mattered. He'd gone looking for a spare leash and found the ledger instead, wedged behind a box of grooming brushes, spine cracked from years of being opened flat on a table, the cardboard corners soft from handling. He almost put it back. Instead, he carried it out into the light and sat on an overturned bucket outside Onyx's run and started reading. The early pages were routine, feeding times, weather notes, a vet visit here and there, the ordinary bookkeeping of an animal's working life. But one name kept recurring in the handler column, Page after page, month after month. Petty Officer A. Voigt. Neat handwriting, economical, the kind that came from someone who filled out the same form so many times his hand had stopped thinking about it. Onyx settled well. Onyx responded to whistle command on first pass. Onyx favors left side approach, note for future handlers. Small margin notes too, things a man writes only for himself. Good day today. She caught the scent before I gave the signal. Soren found himself slowing down over those margin notes more than the official ones. There was a particular tenderness in them, the kind that didn't belong in a training log at all, and yet there it was, page after page, a man quietly proud of a dog nobody else had bothered to write about with any warmth. Then, on a page near the middle of the book, the entries simply stopped. Not faded out. Stopped, mid-week, mid-sentence almost, the final line reading Onyx, demo scheduled 0900 and nothing after it for 11 days. When the log picked back up, a different hand had taken over, tighter, less familiar with the dog, spelling her commands wrong twice in the first week, writing subject in place of her name, as if she'd stopped being an individual animal and started being a case file. Voigt's name never appeared again. Soren sat with the ledger open on his knees for a long moment, the gravel yard quiet except for the tick of the metal roof cooling in the shade and, somewhere inside the run, the soft huff of Onyx settling against the fence to watch him read. He turned back a few pages, reread Good Day Today 3 times, and closed the book carefully, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't ready to leave yet. He found a hallway later that afternoon on his way to chow, not the medical wing, just an administrative corridor near the mess hall. Linoleum floor buffed to a dull shine, and fell into step beside a gunnery sergeant old enough to remember most things twice. Master Chief Alden Rook had been on base longer than the paint on the walls, and he answered Soren's question about Voigt without much interest, the way a man answers a question about weather from 30 years ago. Voigt, yeah, handled that dog for 2 years before the incident. Rook didn't slow his walk, a tray of paperwork balanced on one forearm. Good handler, quiet. Kept to himself mostly, but knew that dog better than anyone I ever saw work a kennel. Got reassigned overseas about a week after the demo went bad. Nobody told me why, and by the time I thought to ask, he was already gone. He shrugged, the gesture of a man who'd stopped being surprised by how quickly the Navy could make a person disappear from a building. That's about all I know. Nobody looked into it before he left? Son, I don't know what they looked into. I know a good handler shipped out fast and a good dog got labeled unfit, and neither one of those things got explained to the rest of us. Rook peeled off toward the mess hall doors, tray shifting, and paused just long enough to add, "Ask records, if you're that curious. Good luck getting past the desk." He said it with the faint, tired humor of a man who'd tried the same desk himself, once, about something else entirely, and given up. Soren didn't go to records that day. He went back to the kennel instead, because it was closer to true, and because some part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades in a different service being told where he was and wasn't allowed to stand, wanted to test something before he asked anyone else's permission. He walked into the run and stood, without thinking about it at first, in the spot the training photos in the ledger had shown Voigt standing in, off to the left, half a step back from center, the angle a left-handed handler favors without knowing why he favors it. Onyx's ears dropped, easy and loose, the way a dog's ears drop when something familiar finally lines up. She rose from where she'd been lying, crossed the run in 3 unhurried steps, and pressed her head briefly against Soren's knee. Then she stepped back and sat, watching him the way she'd watched him from the first day, except the stillness had changed shape, less bracing now, closer to something that might eventually become trust. Soren stood very still, afraid that moving would end it. "You're not looking for a fight," he said quietly. "You're looking for someone who used to stand right here." He crouched down to her level, slow, the way he'd learned, and let his hand rest flat on the gravel between them, rather than reaching for her. She sniffed it once, twice, and didn't pull away. For a long moment neither of them moved, the two of them simply breathing the same salt air, the gate latch ticking faintly against the fence in a gust off the water. That night, lying in his bunk with the ledger's missing pages still turning over in his head, Soren made a decision he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. Tomorrow, he was going to ask to see the original incident file, not the logbook. The real one, whatever the base had kept from the day everything went wrong. He fell asleep still running the sentence Onyx, demo scheduled 0900 through his mind, the way a man worries a loose tooth with his tongue, unable to leave it alone. Outside, the light had shifted from gold to the flat gray of early evening, and Soren realized he'd been sitting on that overturned bucket long enough for his legs to go stiff. He stood slowly, rolling one shoulder, and looked at Onyx through the wire, not asking anything of her, just looking, the way you look at someone after you've learned something true about them that changes how you see everything that came before. She looked back, unbothered, patient, as if she'd known all along that eventually somebody would open that ledger and actually read it to the end. The administrative office smelled like a ceiling fan that had needed oiling for a decade. Soren stood at the counter, request slip already filled out in block letters, incident file, K9 on X, ref DMO incident, date on record, and waited while the duty officer, a lieutenant commander named Prosser, read it without picking it up off the counter. "Why do you want this?" Prosser asked, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man who'd already decided the answer wouldn't change anything. "I've got kennel duty on that dog. Figured I should understand what actually happened. What happened is in the summary that came with your assignment paperwork." Prosser slid the request slip back an inch, not quite handing it over, not quite keeping it. Behind him, a wall clock ticked loud enough to fill the silence, and a fan on his desk turned slowly, ruffling the corner of a memo he'd already stapled shut. "Bid an officer at a demonstration. Case closed. That's the file, son. I'd still like to see the original report, not just the summary." Prosser's jaw shifted, the small motion of a man recalculating how much patience this conversation was worth. That incident's closed, 18 months closed. Digging it back up doesn't help you walk a dog around a yard, and it sure doesn't help the dog. He tapped the counter once, final, the sound flat against the wood. "Leave it closed." "Sir, with respect, has anyone actually reviewed it since it was filed, or has it just been sitting there closed?" Prosser's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger exactly, more with the mild irritation of a man being asked to justify a system he'd never had to justify before. "It's closed because the process closed it. That's how the process works." He said it like the sentence was supposed to end the conversation on its own weight, and for most people, most days, it probably did. He glanced at the stack of folders on the corner of his desk, dozens of them, each one somebody else's closed case, and Soren understood, watching him, that the man wasn't being cruel. He was simply drowning in paper and had learned to stop reading most of it too closely, because reading closely took time he didn't have. Soren didn't argue further. 2 decades of experience had taught him exactly what arguing with a man behind a counter accomplished, which was nothing except a note in a file with his name on it. He picked the slip back up, folded it once along the same crease it already had, and left. Castile was waiting outside, apparently on his way somewhere else entirely, though his timing suggested otherwise. "Heard you were bothering records about the crazy dog," he said, falling into step beside Soren without being invited. "What, you writing a book? Just asking questions." "Yeah, well, some questions get you labeled, just saying. Old guy stirring up trouble about a case everyone already closed. That's not exactly a great look, 3 months into your first hitch." Castile said it almost like advice, the kind that costs the giver nothing and the receiver everything. "Some of us are trying to make an impression here. You keep poking at closed cases, people start wondering what else you're going to poke at." "Noted," Soren said, and kept walking, and didn't slow his pace to match Castile's. That was answer enough. Castile peeled off toward the barracks a moment later, already bored of the conversation, already forgetting Soren's name existed the moment he turned the corner. Soren walked the long way back to the kennel. The base had a way of being loud and empty at the same time. Machinery somewhere, gulls somewhere else, boots on gravel from a formation he could hear but not see, and underneath it all a kind of institutional quiet that swallowed anything that wasn't already written down in triplicate. He passed the corkboard on his way, the duty roster still pinned there with his own name on it, a little curled at the corner now from a week of salt air. Onyx was waiting at the gate when he arrived, which she hadn't done before. She didn't bark, didn't paw at the chain link. She simply stood there, watching the gravel path the way she'd watched Soren's shoulder that first day, not trained to wait, just choosing to. For reasons Soren was only beginning to understand. He sat down outside the run, back against the fence post, legs stretched out in the last of the afternoon sun, the metal warm through his uniform where the sun had been on it all day. Onyx lay down on the other side of the wire, close enough that her shoulder pressed the chain link where his back was. The two of them separated by a few inches of galvanized steel and nothing else. Neither of them said anything because one of them couldn't and the other one had run out of things worth saying to a locked door. The folded request slip sat heavy in his pocket. Prosser's flat refusal, Castile's casual little warnings that always seemed to know exactly where to land. Rook's voice came back to him too. Nobody told me why, and by the time I thought to ask, he was already gone. A sentence that could have applied to Voight, or to Onyx, or, if Soren wasn't careful, to himself in another 18 months. He thought, too, about the version of himself from years ago, in a different uniform, who had learned the hard way that raising your hand too often got you marked as difficult long before it got you answers. That man had learned to go quiet. That man had built a whole career out of going quiet, agreeing when it was easier to agree, letting decisions get made around him rather than by him, right up until the day going quiet stopped being enough to keep him useful, and someone younger got the job he'd wanted instead. He remembered exactly how that had felt. Not like anger, more like being erased slowly from a room he was still standing in, a promotion board that never called his name, a commanding officer who thanked him for his years of service in the same breath he explained why the position had gone to someone else. He'd told himself back then that it didn't matter, that a man could still do good work without being the one everyone looked to. He believed that, mostly. But some nights the belief felt thinner than others, and tonight, with a folded request slip going soft in his pocket, it felt thinner than it had in years. He didn't have official access, he didn't have Prosser's permission, and he wasn't going to get it through the front counter. But there had to be another way into that hallway. There always was. If a man was willing to look somewhere nobody expected him to. A side door, a friendly clerk, a favor owed by somebody who owed somebody else. The Navy ran on paperwork, but paperwork ran on people, and people, in Soren's long experience, were usually more willing to bend a rule for a quiet question than for a formal request stamped and countersigned. "I'm not done," Soren said quietly, to Onyx, to the fence, to nobody official at all. "I'm just going to need a different door." Onyx's tail moved once against the gravel, not a wag exactly, just a shift, like something in her had heard the sentence and understood the shape of it, if not the words. Above them, a gull banked low over the kennel roof and called once, and neither of them looked up. The light went gold, then gray, and Soren stayed there against the fence post until the mess hall bell rang somewhere behind him, and even then he took his time getting up, brushing gravel dust from the seat of his trousers, glancing back once at Onyx before he walked away, as if leaving her, even for the length of dinner, still felt like something worth explaining. Somewhere behind him, deep in the barracks, a radio played low through an open window, some old country song about a road going nowhere in particular, and Soren let it fill the silence for a while instead of his own thoughts, grateful, for once, for something ordinary enough to drown out the noise in his head. Somewhere in the barracks a screen door banged twice, then settled. Soren finished his coffee, stood, and went to find out who worked the archive room. The archive tech's name was Petty Officer Renata Ibarra, and she worked in a room the size of a closet, 3 floors below the records office, surrounded by servers that hummed at a pitch just low enough to feel in the teeth. Soren had found her the way he found most things now, by asking someone who knew someone, patiently, over the course of a week, without ever going back to Prosser's counter. "You're the kennel guy," Ibarra said, not looking up from her terminal, fingers still moving over the keys. "The one asking about the Onyx demo." "I am. I can't pull the incident report. That's records, that's locked, that's a whole thing." She finally looked at him, and there was something almost sympathetic in it, the look of someone who'd fought her own small battles with the same locked cabinets. But the demo was filmed. Standard practice. All public demonstrations get archived for training review. That's the clip they probably showed you already, chopped down for the briefing reel. I can pull the full, unedited file. That's storage, not personnel. Different rules. "How long will that take?" "Give me a day." He gave her a day, and then another, because a day turned into 2 while she chased down which server bank had physically retained footage from 18 months back, given the base's rolling archive policy. Soren spent those 2 days walking Onyx her usual routes, checking her water twice instead of once, trying not to think too hard about what waiting felt like when he'd finally allowed himself to hope. He caught himself, more than once, rehearsing what he'd say to Ashworth if the footage came back clean, and then made himself stop, because rehearsing an ending before you knew the story was a habit that had burned him before, back in a different service, over a different closed door. When Ibarra finally called him back down to the closet-sized room, she didn't waste time on preamble. "I found the reference. I can't play you the footage." Ibarra turned her monitor slightly so he could see the error message himself, a string of code ending in a plain language line that read, "SOPS file overwritten per 18-month retention cycle. Storage is on a rolling 18-month loop. Anything older than that gets recorded over automatically to save space." The clip in the briefing reel survived because someone copied a short excerpt out before the cycle hit. The rest of it, she spread her hands. It's gone. Not hidden. Gone. Soren stood very still in the small room, listening to the server's hum, watching a cursor blink patiently on a screen that had nothing left to show him. "There's no backup," he said. "It wasn't a question. Not really. Not one I have access to. Maybe somewhere higher up there's an archive copy. But that's above my clearance, and probably above yours too." Ibarra's voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry. I really did try. I even checked the off-site mirror, in case. But that runs on the same retention schedule. Whatever cycled out here cycled out there too. I know you did." He meant it. It wasn't her fault that a system built to save disk space had quietly erased the only thing that might have told the truth about 18 months of a closed case. Nobody had erased it out of malice. Nobody had erased it at all, really. It had simply not occurred to anyone, in a year and a half, that it was worth the effort of pulling a copy before the clock ran out. He thanked her and walked out into the corridor, and for a moment the base felt very large and very quiet around him, the way a house feels after everyone in it has gone to sleep. Half a world away, in a barracks room with a window that looked out over a runway instead of an ocean, Anders Voigt sat at a narrow desk with a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was late there, later than it was on Soren's side of the earth, and the overhead light buzzed the way lights buzz in buildings built fast and cheap. He'd started the letter 3 times already, crossed out 2 openings, and settled on a third that felt less like an apology and more like a request, which was closer to what he actually meant. "I am requesting consideration for reassignment back to K9 operations, stateside," he wrote, and then paused, pen hovering, because the next sentence was the one that mattered, and he still didn't know how to write it honestly without sounding like a man asking for something he no longer had any right to ask for. He thought about a dog he hadn't seen in a year and a half. He thought about the sound she used to make, not a bark, just a low exhale, when he came around the corner of the kennel block in the mornings, before anyone else was awake, her tail thumping twice against the concrete before she'd even fully opened her eyes. He thought about the last day he'd handled her, the demo, the way everything had gone sideways so fast that by the time he understood what she'd actually done, he was already being told to pack a bag. Nobody had asked him what happened. He'd tried to explain it once, to an officer who'd already stopped listening halfway through, and after that he'd stopped trying, because a man who keeps insisting on his own version of events starts to sound, eventually, like a man protecting himself instead of the dog. So he'd packed the bag. He'd shipped out, he'd told himself, in the months since, that this was simply how the service worked. Orders came, a man followed them, and whatever got left behind stayed left behind. It had taken him a long time, longer than he liked to admit, to stop believing that. Some nights he still dreamed about the training field, not the bite itself, just the ordinary minutes before it. Checking Onyx's harness, the smell of cut grass, the flat gray light of a base morning before anything had gone wrong yet. He always woke up before the dream reached the part that mattered, as if some part of him refused to watch it again even in sleep. He signed the letter, he folded it, the crease sharp under his thumbnail. He set it in the outgoing mail tray on the corner of his desk, where it would sit until the next transport run gathered up whatever paperwork the base had generated that week, and carried it toward a mail system that moved, at best, on its own unhurried schedule. He had no way of knowing that on the other side of the world, a man he had never met was standing in a server room, staring at an error message, trying to work out how to prove something that the archive itself had just quietly decided didn't need proving. Back on base, Soren walked the long path from the records building toward the kennels, the setting sun throwing his shadow out ahead of him across the gravel, longer than he was. He didn't go straight to Onyx's run. He stopped a few yards short of the gate and stood there, hands in his pockets, running the numbers one more time. No footage, no cooperation from records, no path forward that didn't require someone above his rank deciding, out of nowhere, to care. Onyx was watching him from inside the run, the way she always watched now, ears pricked, weight settled low and even, nothing about her braced for disappointment anymore. Soren reached for the gate latch and stopped, his hand resting flat on the cold metal without opening it. For the first time since he'd read his own name on that duty roster, he let himself consider the plainest, easiest option available to him. Request reassignment off kennel duty. Let someone else finish out the rotation. Go back to being a man nobody noticed, which was, if he was honest, the only kind of man he'd ever really known how to be safely. His hand stayed on the latch a long moment, not moving either way, while behind the fence Onyx sat down slowly, unhurried, and waited for him to decide. The same patient stillness she'd offered him from the very first day, as if she'd already decided, long before he had, what kind of man he was going to turn out to be. He stood there long enough that the gravel cooled under his boots. Then he opened the latch, went in, and sat down next to her instead of walking away. He didn't open the latch. He let his hand drop, and the next morning he took Onyx to her scheduled checkup, instead of putting in the transfer request he'd half-written in his head the night before. The veterinary clinic sat near the motor pool, low-ceilinged, smelling of antiseptic and dog fur, and the particular tang of a floor that got mopped with the same industrial cleaner every morning, at 0500. A row of metal chairs lined the waiting area, empty this early except for a young handler flipping through a clipboard, his own dog asleep at his feet. The vet on duty, a lieutenant named Priya Osei, had Onyx up on the exam table with the easy confidence of someone who'd handled 100 dogs more difficult than this one, her gloved fingers moving along the dog's jaw with practiced patience. "She's due for her routine dental," Osei said, running gloved fingers along Onyx's jaw while the dog held remarkably still, eyes on Soren the whole time. "Standard checkup after any bite incident, even one this old. Protocol requires it gets logged, even years out." "Even years out," Soren repeated. "Every K9 involved in a reportable incident gets a full dental workup logged at time of event, then periodic follow-ups after. It's routine, mostly to check for tooth fracture, that kind of thing, from whatever object was involved." Osei said it without looking up, the way people say things that are obvious to them and invisible to everyone else. "You know she's actually got one on file from the day it happened. Same afternoon, if I remember the chart right." Soren went still. "From the day of the demo, the bite." "Should be, yeah. We always work up a full dental exam right after any incident like that, checking for damage. Sometimes there's fragments left behind depending on what was involved. Standard medical follow-up, nothing to do with the investigation side of things." Osei finally glanced up, reading something in his face. "You didn't know that existed?" "No," Soren said. "Nobody mentioned it." "Wouldn't surprise me. Medical records and incident reports don't exactly talk to each other around here. Different departments, different forms, different filing cabinets on different floors." She said it lightly, like a fact of institutional life too ordinary to be worth resenting, and went back to running her fingers along Onyx's gum line, checking each tooth in turn with the unhurried care of a woman who trusted her own hands more than any chart. "If you want to see it, it should be in her file down in the medical archive. Third drawer, probably. We file by animal, not by incident." Soren stood very still in the middle of the exam room, hands loose at his sides, his breath catching once, sharp, nothing like the disappointment he'd braced for. The exam table's steel surface caught the overhead light in a thin bright line down its center. "You're saying there's a record from that exact day, sitting in a drawer this whole time?" "I'm saying there's probably a record from that exact day, sitting in a drawer this whole time." Osei smiled slightly, not unkind, just amused at how surprised he looked. "Welcome to military paperwork. Everything's written down somewhere. Finding the right somewhere is the whole trick." He almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a breath he'd been holding for a week, finally letting go, quiet, involuntary. "Can I see it?" "Not right this second. I've got 3 more animals scheduled this morning." Osei checked the clipboard hanging at the end of the table, an old shepherd waiting patiently in the hallway already, tail thumping against the doorframe. "But come by this afternoon. I'll have someone pull the file for you." She patted Onyx once on the flank, done with the exam. "For what it's worth, teeth look fine. No new damage. Whatever's in that old file, it's not going to change anything about her health today." "It might change something else, though," Soren said, more to himself than to her. Osei glanced at him, curious but not prying, the look of a woman who had learned long ago that not every question in her clinic was really about the animal on the table. "Might," she agreed. "That's above my pay grade. I just keep the teeth clean." Soren nodded, only half listening now, his mind already 3 floors down and 18 months back, in a filing cabinet nobody had thought to open because nobody had thought to ask 2 departments to compare notes. He led Onyx back out into the morning light, her lead loose in his hand, and for the length of the walk back to the kennel she stayed close against his leg in a way she hadn't before, not pulling ahead, not hanging back, just there, matching his pace like she already sensed something was different about today. A jeep rolled past on the access road. She didn't so much as glance at it. "A second file," Soren said out loud, mostly to himself, mostly just to hear the shape of the words. Nobody put it next to the first one. He didn't know yet what the dental report would say. He only knew that for the first time since he'd stood in front of Prosser's counter and been told to leave it closed, he had a door that hadn't been locked on purpose, just forgotten, the way a hallway gets forgotten when nobody has any reason to walk down it. He spent the rest of the morning on chores he barely noticed himself doing, refilling water bowls, sweeping the run, checking the latch on the gate twice though it had never once failed. Every so often he caught himself glancing toward the medical wing, toward the hour hand of his watch, willing the morning to move faster than mornings on this base ever moved. Onyx, for her part, seemed unbothered by the wait. She lay in the shade with her chin on her paws, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even, the picture of a dog with nowhere else she needed to be. At noon he ate standing up by the mess hall door instead of sitting, too restless to hold still, and threw half the sandwich away uneaten. Delgado asked him what was wrong, and Soren said nothing, just a long morning, because the truth felt too fragile to say out loud before he'd actually seen the paper it depended on. That afternoon he was going to walk down it. By the time the afternoon finally arrived, Soren had rehearsed the walk to the medical archive so many times in his head that his boots seemed to know the way on their own, carrying him past the mess hall, past the corkboard, past the same fence post he'd sat against 3 nights running, straight toward whatever the third drawer down had been keeping quiet for 18 months. Somewhere behind the mess hall a truck backed up, its warning beep steady and unhurried, and Soren found himself matching his own footsteps to it without meaning to, one boot after another, closer to whatever the afternoon had waiting for him. The folder was exactly where Osei's assistant said it would be, third drawer down, wedged between a supply requisition and a vaccination log, the same drawer Soren had walked past twice that week without knowing it. K9, Minex, Dental, the tape read, the ink underneath faded but legible. 18 months of dust along the crease. Osei set it on the exam table between them and opened it herself, since Soren's hands weren't entirely steady. Here. She turned the top page toward him. Full workup, dated the same day as the incident. Someone did their job that afternoon, at least. Her finger traced down the page, past routine measurements, past a diagram of a dog's jaw with small notations in a doctor's cramped shorthand, and stopped on a single line near the bottom. Foreign material recovered, upper right canine region, plastic metal composite fragment, consistent with training equipment, retained for records. Soren read it twice. A fragment, from the demo field. Looks that way. Osei flipped to the next page, an addendum stapled behind the main report, written in the same hand but clearly added after some reflection. She read it aloud, slower this time, because the words mattered and she seemed to know it. Bite pattern assessment, dentition marks consistent with pulling grip, lateral drag pattern, not bite and hold. This pattern typically indicates an animal attempting to pull an object or person away from a fixed point, rather than an aggressive hold and control bite. Recommend cross-reference with incident report for context. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall a door closed. Ordinary, unhurried, no idea what was happening 3 doors away. A cartwheel squeaked once and faded. Cross-reference with incident report, Soren repeated. Did anyone? Osei looked at the file stamp in the corner, a small square meant for routing initials, entirely blank. Doesn't look like it. This went into the medical archive and just stayed there. Nobody from the incident side ever requested it, and medical doesn't send files anywhere unless somebody asks. Soren thought about the training field behind the kennels, about Castile mentioning offhand that some of the old demo gear had never been fully cleared. He thought about a training exercise, a live demonstration, an officer standing somewhere he shouldn't have been standing, close to equipment that had been left in the ground. She wasn't attacking him, Soren said slowly, working it out loud, the way a man works out a sentence he's not yet sure he's allowed to say. She was pulling him away from something. That's what this document is telling you, yeah. Osei closed the folder gently, like it deserved to be handled with some care after 18 months of not being handled at all. I can't tell you what he was standing near. I can only tell you what her teeth did, and what her teeth did wasn't an attack pattern. Soren didn't wait for permission this time. He carried the folder himself. Osei let him, said, "Take it. It's medical property, but I trust you not to lose it," and walked it straight across base to the command building, past Prosser's counter without stopping, up a flight of stairs he'd never had reason to climb before, to a door with Captain R. Ashworth stenciled in block letters. He knocked before he could talk himself out of it. Ashworth was a broad-shouldered man behind a desk too tidy for someone who'd been avoiding a subject for 18 months. And when Soren said Onyx's name, something in his face closed, briefly, the way a door closes on instinct before a person decides whether to open it again. "I need 5 minutes, sir." "I've read the incident summary, petty officer. There's nothing new to discuss." "There's a second file. Medical never sent it to your desk, and nobody ever asked for it." Soren set the folder down, opened to the addendum, and slid it across without another word, because he'd learned by now that some things landed better without him explaining them first. Ashworth looked at it for a long moment without touching it, one hand still resting flat on the closed lid of his own binder, as if some part of him needed a moment before he let a stranger's paperwork into the small, careful order he'd built around this subject for 18 months. Then he pulled the file closer and read. And Soren watched something happen to his face that no summary report had managed to do in all that time. The particular stillness of a man encountering a fact that rearranges everything he thought he already understood. His thumb pressed flat against the edge of the page like he needed something solid to hold onto while he read it twice. "Pulling grip," Ashworth said quietly, half to himself. "Lateral drag." He set the page down and looked past Soren, toward the window, toward something that wasn't in the room. "There was a training charge buried near where I was standing that day. Old demo ordnance, inert, but nobody had confirmed it was fully cleared before the exercise. I remember someone mentioning it afterward, in passing, like it was a footnote." He looked back down at the file. "I never connected it to the bite. I never looked." He reached for the desk drawer, pulled out a slim binder, the original incident report Soren realized, the one Prosser had refused to release, and laid it open beside the medical addendum. 2 documents, side by side on a wooden desk, 18 months and 1 hallway apart, finally in the same room, finally close enough to touch. Ashworth read them both, moving his finger back and forth between the pages, matching dates, matching times, matching a location marked on a training field diagram against the exact spot the dental report described the fragment coming from. His jaw worked once, and he set his pen down without writing anything, and for a long moment he didn't say a word at all. Outside the window, a truck downshifted somewhere near the motor pool, the sound rising and falling and disappearing. "She pulled me," he said finally, "away from that charge, and I signed off on discharging her for it." Soren didn't answer. There didn't seem to be anything worth saying that would improve on the silence. Ashworth sat with that for a long moment, both hands flat on the desk now, bracketing the 2 open files like a man holding down papers in a wind that wasn't there. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the flatness it carried at the counter that morning. It sounded almost young. Soren had never heard it, but he recognized the shape of it anyway, the sound of a man's certainty coming apart and something more honest standing up in its place. "I remember being angry," Ashworth said. "In the moment, I remember thinking the dog had turned on me for no reason. I never once asked myself what she might have seen that I hadn't." He closed both files carefully, squared their edges against the desk, and stood. He looked older, suddenly, in the way a man looks older the moment he stops holding something in. "I need to talk to the whole unit," he said. "Today, if I can manage it. This isn't something that gets fixed in a memo." He looked at Soren properly then, for the first time since he'd walked in. "You went and found this yourself." "Medical found it. I just walked it across the hall." "You walked it across a hallway nobody walked in 18 months, petty officer." Ashworth picked both folders up, one in each hand, and for a moment just held them there, weighing something that had nothing to do with paper. "That's not nothing." He set them back down on the desk, side by side, and rested his palm flat over both at once, the gesture of a man closing a debt he finally understood the size of. "I need to be the one who says it out loud," he said quietly. "Not a memo, everyone." He was already reaching for the phone on his desk before Soren had fully turned to leave, calling down to the yeoman's office to clear the training field for an all-hands muster before the light went. his voice steady now, in a way it hadn't been minutes earlier. A man who had finally decided what he owed, and to whom. Soren stepped out into the corridor a few minutes later, the folders still on Ashworth's desk behind him, and stood for a moment in the ordinary fluorescent light, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into something he could actually carry. Somewhere down the hall, a phone was already ringing, Ashworth's, most likely, the first call of many that evening, and Soren thought, and felt something close to astonishment, that he had walked into that office expecting to be turned away again, and instead had watched 18 months come apart in under 10 minutes. The whole unit assembled on the training field that evening, the same field where the demo gear still sat half buried in the grass at the edge everyone had learned to walk around without asking why. Ashworth stood in front of them without notes, the 2 files in his hand, and told the story straight through, the fragment, the bite pattern, the training charge nobody had confirmed clear, the 18 months a dog spent labeled dangerous for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do, which was protect a handler from something that could have killed him. "I signed the paperwork that ended her career," Ashworth said, his voice carrying flat and even across the field, the last light going orange behind him. "I signed it based on a summary I never questioned, from a report I never fully read, about a dog I never once asked to see again. That's on me. Not on Onyx. And not on the handler who lost his post over a decision that was mine to make and mine to get wrong." He let that sit a moment, the field quiet enough that Soren could hear the flag rope ticking against its pole somewhere behind the formation. "There's a second thing I need to say," Ashworth went on. "Petty Officer Voigt requested a hearing after the incident. That request never reached my desk. I don't know where it stalled, and finding out is going to be my job over the next few weeks, not yours. But he asked, and nobody answered him. And that's a failure that belongs to this command, not to one man who's had to carry it alone on the other side of the world." Nobody laughed. Nobody checked a phone. Soren stood near the back with Onyx sitting calm against his leg, and for once the stillness in the crowd felt like something other than boredom, a room full of people realizing, together, that they'd all walked past the same closed door without ever once trying the handle. Castile broke from the formation before Ashworth had even finished dismissing everyone, crossing the field with none of his usual swagger, and stopped in front of Soren looking like a much younger man than the one who'd cracked jokes by the corkboard 3 weeks earlier. "Hey." Castile rubbed the back of his neck. "I gave you a hard time, about the kennel duty, about all of it." He glanced down at Onyx, who watched him without tension for the first time since he'd ever come near her. "I was wrong. About her, and about you being too old to handle it. You handled it better than anybody on this base has in a year and a half. You didn't know," Soren said. It wasn't quite forgiveness. It was closer to fact, offered plainly, the way Osei had offered the addendum. "Yeah, well, I could have asked instead of joking." Castile stuck his hand out, and Soren shook it, a firm, ordinary handshake between 2 men on a field going dark. And that was the whole of it. No speech, no swelling music, just something settled that had never needed to be complicated in the first place. A few other recruits drifted over after that, quieter, less certain what to say, offering small nods or a hand on Soren's shoulder that meant more than any of them managed to put into words. Delgado just grinned at him from a distance, the same easy grin he'd worn since the first day, unchanged because he'd never needed convincing. Even the wiry kid from the briefing room, the one who'd first mentioned Onyx's name to him without much thought, caught his eye across the field and gave a short, respectful nod, the kind men give each other when words feel unnecessary. Ashworth came last, after the crowd had mostly dispersed, crossing the grass slowly, the way a man walks when he's not entirely sure of his welcome. He stopped a few feet from Onyx and crouched, lowering himself to her level, and held out one hand, palm open, the same gesture he must have offered 18 months ago before everything went wrong. Onyx watched him for a long moment, the field quiet around them, the last of the gulls settling somewhere out past the fence line. Then she stepped forward and let his hands settle on the top of her head, and didn't pull away, and didn't tense, and simply stood there being touched by the man she'd once pulled to safety and then spent a year and a half being blamed for saving. Ashworth's hands stayed there a while. Nobody said anything. The wind came in off the water the way it always did at that hour, carrying salt and the faint metallic smell of the gear still sitting in the grass, and none of it needed a single word attached to it. "She's yours," Ashworth said finally, looking up at Soren, "officially. I'll have the paperwork ready by end of week, full transfer, permanent handler assignment. You earned that the hard way, walking a hallway the rest of us should have walked a long time ago." Soren looked down at Onyx, who looked back up at him with the same patient stillness she'd carried since the first morning at the gate, except the waiting had gone out of it now. What was left just looked like being home. "Yes, sir," Soren said, and it was the steadiest his voice had sounded in 18 months of his own, on a base full of men younger than him who had, for one evening at least, stopped counting the years. They walked back toward the kennel together as the field emptied out behind them, Ashworth falling into step beside Soren without quite meaning to, both of them quiet, both of them in their own separate ways, lighter than they'd been that morning. 3 weeks later, a letter went out through official channels to a base overseas, addressed to Anders Voigt, informing him that the incident on his record had been formally reviewed and cleared, and that the dog he'd trained for 2 years had been publicly and officially exonerated. It crossed paths, somewhere over an ocean neither of them could see, with a letter already in transit the other way, Voigt's own request for reassignment back to K9 operations. He would learn, eventually, that nobody had ever meant to silence him. Distance had simply done it for them, until someone walked far enough down a hallway to close the gap. Soren walked Onyx down that same hallway most evenings now, a habit that had settled into him. The hallway that had once held 2 files, 2 drawers apart, close enough to touch if anyone had thought to carry one to the other. Tonight it was just a hallway. Fluorescent lights humming low and warm, Onyx's claws ticking softly beside him with the unhurried rhythm of a dog who finally knew where she belonged. No longer the oldest recruit anyone bothered to notice, no longer a man waiting to be told he wasn't needed. Just a man and a dog, walking the same short distance that had taken 18 months to close.